Thank you. Thank you very much, Suki. That was a really welcoming and warm introduction. And it's great to be talking in connection with International Women's Day and to follow on from Priya Atwal's great talk last week. I hope to give a completely different perspective on royal women, and I hope you enjoy the talk. So my topic for today gives a new perspective on a moment of India's history known as the Vellore Mutiny. It was a huge event that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of people at Vellore in 1806. It was later eclipsed, though, by the events of 1857, and so it is less known to us today. The thing that makes this rereading of the Vellore Mutiny so interesting is that it hinges on the actions of women. So my research involves looking through colonial archives in the UK, and I kid you not, it is difficult. It's quite difficult to find perspectives on women inside East India Company sources. It's difficult to find perspectives on women inside East India Company records. And this next slide shows you what you typically find. So this is a letter from a solicitor that's addressed to the East India Company's Court of Directors in London. And it was written by this solicitor on behalf of a woman who was widowed at Bombay, and she was granted a widow's pension. And then she decided, she was a British woman who decided to return to Britain. So the solicitor's letter is a petition saying that they want her pension to continue now that she's back in England. And obviously for someone who's researching their family history, this is a fantastic piece of information to find. It's a real gold mine, but let's face it, it is not terribly interesting to the rest of us. So when you come across something like this, it's very exciting. Now, this is the first document I saw in the British Library in the East India Company records that shows the women of Tipu Sultan's court at Vellore. What I've shown here on the left side is the first page of this document, and then following pages I've put on the right hand side. It's a list of 412 women's names, and it was compiled at Vellore in 1823, almost a quarter of a century after Tipu Sultan's death. Now I'm just going to, where's my mouse? So I'm going to show you a close-up of this bit here, where you have the headings for this list. This is really interesting. So charge or crime for these 412 women? None. Date of first imprisonment since the capture of Srirangapatnam in May 1799. In what jail, placed or confined? The palaces built at Vellore by order of government. And then by whose authority? By authority of the Governor General. And of course, the Governor General, as we all know, he was the East India Company's person at Fort St. George, Calcutta, who made important decisions on the behalf of the company, which was headquartered in London. So, but what's going on here with these 412 women who have been arrested and imprisoned on no charge? I decided to dig a little deeper into the East India Company's records to try and find more information about these women. And I encountered all sorts of bits of information about them. And I've just written down here some of the adjectives that were used to describe them. So they were described as petulant, troublesome, and my favorite, extremely outrageous. There were just over 600 women living inside Tipu Sultan's palace at the time of his death in 1799. And more than a third of them were either professional singers and dancers known as Musarratis or their servants. And this talk's title, Mysore Musarratis, comes from this term that refers to these singers and dancers. So as professional performers, they were the most outspoken group of women within the court at Srirangapatnam. Histories of the East India Company usually focus on the actions of men. For example, any history of the siege of Srirangapatna in 1799 will focus on the actions of the British and East India Company armies coming into conflict with Tipu's armies, as we see here. Or they focus on the death of Tipu Sultan at the Watergate, or the capture of Tipu Sultan's sons, who were the potential heirs to the throne of Mysore. Now, this painting here is titled The Last Effort and Fall of Tipu Sultan, and it gives a very typical British reading of India's imperial history. The artist, Henry Singleton, never went to India, so this is very much a fantasy, what we see here. The painting's subject matter is totally focused on military actions. It shows at its center this sort of final frenzied moment of Tipu Sultan's life before he was killed by an anonymous British soldier. And you can see he's bareheaded because, look, his turban has very dramatically fallen to the ground. So it's all, it's very scripted and fantastical. Here are 4 portraits of Tipu Sultan's sons. Tipu had more than 4 sons. I'm just showing 4 pictures here. They were exiled to Vellore along with their other brothers between 1799 and 1801. And then in 1806, after the Vellore Mutiny, they were exiled again to Calcutta. Their mothers, who lived amongst the 600 plus women in the palace at Srirangapatnam, they too were banished from Mysore Kingdom and sent to Vellore Fort, but not until 1802. Information about these women, as written in East India Company records, has up to now been ignored. And by exploring these accounts, we can reevaluate the events of the Vellore Mutiny. So the next thing I'm going to do is talk a little bit more about who the Musarratis were and what they did at court. So the Mysore Musarratis were female singers and dancers who performed before mixed audiences. That is, the audiences they performed at could be men and women, on behalf of Tipu Sultan and also on behalf of the women of his court. So say there was an important festival, a family occasion, such as a wedding or any sort of celebration in honor of a family member, the Musarratis would entertain the guests. And I've only really found one written account of the Mysore Musarratis' performances. It's actually a description of Hyder Ali Khan's female entourage from the 1770s. So Hyder Ali was the founder of the Mysore Sultanate, and he was the father of Tipu Sultan. Hyder Ali died in 1782, and Tipu Sultan succeeded him to the throne of Mysore. So this is the fly cover of the book where this account is. The account was written by a Frenchman named Maistre de la Tour. So right here you have by Monsieur Maistre de la Tour, right? And he served in Hyder Ali's army as the commander-in-chief of artillery. And the title of his 2-volume book, which was translated into English in 1784, is The History of Hyder Ali Khan, as you see here. So in his book, Maistre de la Tour describes music and dance performances that he attended at Hyder Ali's court in the 1770s. And I'm now going to read to you de la Tour's description of the Musarratis. Their habit is always a fine gauze, very rightly embroidered with gold, and they are covered with jewels. Their head, their neck, their ears, their breasts, their arms, fingers, legs, and toes have their jewels. And even their nose is ornamented with a small diamond that gives them an arch look, which is far from being unpleasing. De la Tour also described the performances that they gave, and he refers to them as comedians. This is just it's the French word for an actress. So they're not stand-up comics, or at least there's nothing to say they were stand-up comics. And I quote, "The comedians of the court are all women. A directress, who is likewise manager, purchases young girls at the age of 4 or 5 years, who are chosen on account of their beauty. She causes them to be inoculated, and then provides them with masters, both for dancing and music. They are taught every accomplishment that can inspire the prince and his court with the love of pleasure, and their success is such they delight and seduce the most insensible of men. The comedies are all pieces of intrigue. They personate either women who league together to deceive a jealous husband, or young girls that conspire to deceive their mother." End of quote. So we know 2 important things from Maistre de la Tour's account. First of all, we know that these performances were both written and performed by the women. And number 2, we know that their storylines were about the misadventures of women and girls who tricked and deceived their superiors. So, and as I mentioned earlier, the Musarratis were just part of a larger entourage. So I'm now going to look a little bit closer at what these different types of female courtiers did. And to help with that, I'm going to show you part of a report that was written in 1800 by this young man. This is a portrait of Thomas Marriott, the young man who was placed in charge of the women of the inner court in 1799. When he began in this role, he was about 26 years old, and his report, dated June 1800, counted 601 women as residing inside the palace at Srirangapatnam. So I just want to emphasize here that the East India Company has placed a 26-year-old man in charge of over 600 women. So Thomas Marriott had studied a number of South Asian languages. So he was placed in charge of the women because of his language abilities. It was assumed that he was well suited to communicate with them. And the report that he authored in June 1800 about the women the purpose of it was to determine whether any of these women could be released from the palace to live with their previous families or friends. And then the other purpose of the report was to determine what to do with the women who had nowhere to go. Marriott had to recommend how the East India Company should best deal with them. So the slide that I'm showing here, this is a 2-page opening from Thomas Marriott's 1800 report. The entire report is 10 pages long, and I've chosen to show these 2 particular pages because they classify the 601 women who lived inside the palace at Srirangapatnam. So right at the bottom here, you can see total women in both, in the mahals, 601. That brings me to the main division that he saw between the women. Very straightforward division. You have on the page on the left, the women in Tipu Sultan's mahal. So these were women from Tipu Sultan's private entourage, and they lived in a particular part of the palace called the Tipu Mahal. And then on the other side, you have Hyder's mahal. So those are the women from Tipu's deceased father's entourage, and they live in another part of the palace called the Hyder Mahal. And these 2 separate entourages lived inside of the palace. And so Thomas Marriott listed them separately and determined the level of support that these women might require should they stay on, have nowhere to go beyond the palace. And he formulated different levels of maintenance by ranking them according to their status, their position, the work they did, the number of attendants they had, these kind of things. So the next slide is these same 2 pages again, but I have put in some little blue arrows just to give you an idea of how Marriott was ranking the women. So I've labeled the highest ranking women here as queens. So you can see these were the legal wives of Tipu Sultan and his father, Hyder Ali. They came from important royal lineages, and they had the highest ratio of servants within the palace. So they would have received the most generous allowances under Marriott's provisions. So there are 2 queens in the Tipu Mahal and 3 in the Hyder Mahal. And you can see here that for 3 women here, the 3 queens of Hyder Ali, there were 34 servants. So there were at least 10 servants per woman. That's the highest amount that you find in the mahals. Then below them, you have the artists. I've labeled them this because they were the women who are trained in music and dance. They are described as unmarried women, and they rank just below the queens. Then below them, you have the workers, the women who performed infrastructural roles within the palace, such as cooks, nurses, seamstresses, messengers, dairy workers, sweepers, and so on. And they received the lowest allowances. Now, the next slide I'm going to show is a close-up of the top of the Tipu Mahal page on the left, just so you, oh golly, here it is. And I want to show you this close-up because you can see where the name Musarrati appears for the first time. So you have the wives of Tipu, 2 wives, and then you have the first class of unmarried women called Gayan, which we know means singer, or Musarrati. from their accomplishments in playing, singing, etc. And there were, in the Tipu Mahal, there were 51 of them, and they had 124 attendants and slaves. So they had at least 2 servants, slaves each. There's another section of Thomas Marriott's report. I'm not going to show it to you, but it describes where the women came from. So he tells us that most of the 601 women were from Mysorean Hindu families, and others were from Delhi, Kashmir, Arcot, Hyderabad, and Tanjore. Some of the women were purchased as slaves, including women who came from as far away as Constantinople and Georgia. This report is important because it overturns one of the prevailing Orientalist attitudes about Tipu Sultan's court women. It makes really, really clear that most of the women who lived in the palace were not particularly young. I mean, there would have been beautiful young women in the palace, but nearly half of the women were from the entourage of Tipu Sultan's deceased father. And Hyder Ali had died in 1782, almost 20 years before this report was compiled. So these women in the Hyder Mahal, some of them would have been the mothers of Tipu Sultan's half siblings. We know that Tipu Sultan's mother had died by then. And by 1800, certainly many of the women of the Hyder Mahal would have been grandmothers. Some of them could have even been great-grandmothers. There is an account of a visit to Srirangapatnam in August 1800 by a British woman who visited the women of the Mahals. And she wrote about the women that, and I quote, "There are many that have the great remains of beauty, but few are young." So the reality of these women stands in contrast to these sort of sensationalized images of Tipu's female entourage that were circulated in the West. Tipu Sultan's harem was described in Britain as made up of young, powerless women. And in this slide, I have 2 images. The one on the left is actually a detail from some curtain fabric, which is printed with scenes from Tipu Sultan's life. And this particular part of the fabric shows the Tipu watching these women who are performing like the 3 graces. You know, they look like sort of classical Greek sort of things. And then in the background, there is a chap holding an umbrella, and then behind him is a woman who's being grabbed behind by some guy. And then the picture on the right of this slide, this is a really vulgar political cartoon from 1800 showing British soldiers attacking the women of Tipu's harem. And they're all shown as these young sort of, they basically look like the kind of British women who would have been in dance halls, but they've darkened their skin. So these 2 pictures reflect Orientalist attitudes towards these women as exotic playthings, which they weren't, and probably contributed to the overlooking of what these women did. So let's go on to, I'm actually going to go backwards to here, because I want to just talk very quickly again about Thomas Marriott's 1800 report. So I just want to emphasize that the report's purpose was to propose how to deal with the women who lived in the palace at Srirangapatnam. And in preparation for sending them into exile to Vellore, Thomas Marriott was doing 3 things. First of all, he was reducing their numbers. Secondly, he was proposing how to organize their care if they remained. And then thirdly, he was organizing and preparing to oversee their transport from Srirangapatnam to Vellore, in 1802. So this is a map of the fort at Vellore in the mid-19th century. And for those of you who've been there, you'll probably already know that there are two areas inside of the fort, which are called the Tipu Mahal and the Hyder Mahal. And these apartments, which are marked on this map as sort of that U-shaped building with harem written on the side of it. These apartments were constructed by the British to accommodate the women. Now, I couldn't quite resist the next slide. This is a screenshot I took from Google Maps just the other day. And it's quite good fun because it actually has they still call these buildings the Tipu and Hyder Mahal. You can see it on Google Maps. And these apartments were built by the British to imitate the organization of the women's quarters inside the palace at Srirangapatnam, the Tipu Mahal, the Hyder Mahal. And they were constructed by an East India Company engineer named John Goldingham. John Goldingham, another of his construction projects was Madras Government House. This is the Tipu Mahal as it looks today. You can't go to the Hyder Mahal. Apparently it's in pieces. There's not much to see. But the Tipu Mahal is still being used today. It was a prison in the 20th century. I understand it's where Tamil tigers were held. But today it is accommodation for trainee policemen. So the East India Company arranged for these buildings to be constructed, but it didn't actually pay for their construction. That was paid for by this little chap. This is a portrait of Krishnaraja Wodeyar III. He became the king of Mysore in June 1799, just a few weeks after the fall of Srirangapatnam. And he looks very young because he was about 6 years old. So the funding for the women's maintenance and the construction of the mahals at Vellore was paid for by the newly appointed Wodeyar court of Mysore. Following Tipu Sultan's death, the East India Company identified the descendants of the Mysorean family that Tipu Sultan's father, Hyder Ali, had seized power from in the early 1760s. And then the company identified from within this family who should be the heir to Mysore's throne, and they chose this little boy. This portrait of Krishnaraja Wodeyar III was probably painted very soon after his coronation on the 30th of June, 1799. And the kingdom he inherited was taxed by the East India Company to pay for all kinds of things, one of which was the maintenance costs for Tipu Sultan's exiled court and the construction of the mahals inside Vellore Fort. This is a map of Mysore Kingdom during Tipu Sultan's rule, and I've circled in blue the locations of Srirangapatnam and Vellore. So Mysore Kingdom is colored yellow, and then what they called Madras Presidency is, which was under East India Company control, is in pink. So I wanted to show this slide because it shows very clearly that the purpose of sending Tipu's family to Vellore was to relocate them outside the borders of Mysore Kingdom. And by doing this, they were trying to prevent any attempts at an insurrection. So the construction of the mahals inside Vellore Fort was completed in 1802, and the women were then transported overland from Mysore Kingdom to Vellore Fort. And so the way they traveled, at least the way I've worked out they traveled, was they went up to Bangalore, and then from Bangalore they went down towards Krishnagiri, and then from there they went along the bank of the river Palar to Vellore. There are some really amusing letters about the move in the private correspondence of Arthur Wellesley. Arthur Wellesley was the governor of Srirangapatnam at that time. And the letters reveal some unexpected problems relating to the transport of the women to Vellore. So they were moved in two groups, and as you'd expect, those two groups were the Hyder Mahal women and the Tipu Mahal women. So the women of the Hyder Mahal were moved first in May 1802, and then the women of the Tipu Mahal were moved in June 1802. And in the lead up to the move in April, just a few weeks before the move began, Thomas Marriott wrote to Arthur Wellesley to tell him that of the original 601 women of the Mahals in Srirangapatnam's palace, there were now 345 individuals left. So a reduction of almost half. What a good job he'd done. And arrangements for moving this reduced entourage seemed to be going well until the 9th of May, 1802, the actual day that they were departing for Vellore, when Marriott wrote a letter saying that, unbeknownst to him, an additional 206 women had been smuggled into their midst. 106 of the newcomers were in the Hyder Mahal, and an estimated 100 more were in the Tipu Mahal. And in the letter where he announces this unexpected increase, he wrote, and I quote, "The only way I see of getting rid of them, except by force, is to dismiss them from the Mahal whenever their mistresses die." So the word of this unexpected increase reached Vellore, where Thomas Dallas, the man who was in charge of receiving them inside the newly constructed Mahals, was waiting. And so Thomas Dallas, he wrote back to Marriott and instructed him thus, I quote, "You had better, on the road down, mention the impossibility of my receiving into the Mahals here any but those who were originally belonging to the Mahals at Seringapatam, as the extra women must have been introduced without our knowledge." So Thomas Dallas in Vellore was obviously expecting the women to obey a direct command from a man. And it probably didn't cross his mind that the women would simply refuse to obey such an order. In any case, a few days later, something had happened that changed Thomas Dallas's recommendation on how to handle the newcomers. And in a letter to Arthur Wellesley, he wrote, and I quote, "I think they had better be allowed to remain, as discharging them would only cause dissatisfaction, which it may be as well to avoid." So after this first stage of the move was completed and the women of the Hyder Mahal, along with their extra 100-odd women, were at Vellore, the second stage of the move began with the women of the Tipu Mahal. And in this second stage of the move, there is no discussion in the correspondence about sending away newcomers. The difficulties with transporting the women, as recorded in these letters, show that the British men who were in charge of the move were taken aback by the women's recalcitrance. The men were incapable of dealing with their behavior and so they chose to just let the women have their way. Thomas Marriott wrote in one of his letters that it was the Musarrati women, the storytellers, the first-class unmarried women, who were the most forceful. It was they who had insisted on bringing the 200 plus extra women from Srirangapatnam to Vellore because, and I quote, Tipu allowed all of the first class, or Musarratis, 2 slaves each during his life. So you get a sense that Thomas Marriott's work with the women is conflicting with the directives he's being set by the East India Company. And I've made this slide to show the changing numbers of the women. So in Thomas Marriott's June 1800 report, as I showed you earlier, there were 601 women. Then in April 1802, he writes to Arthur Wellesley that there are now 345 women. Then by the end of the move to Vellore, there are 583 women. And then, this is the crazy bit, by January 1806, there are 790 women. So in the years immediately after their arrival at Vellore, the Mahal's population continued to increase. Give them an inch and they took a mile. By 1806, there were 790 individuals living in the Mahals of Vellore Fort. And this wasn't the only population increase at Vellore during that period. Tipu's entourage was followed to Vellore by thousands of Mysorean citizens. This is a map from a guidebook showing the center of Vellore as it is today. And it shows where one would most likely arrive after stepping out of a bus or a taxi. You can see there's a big, there's a taxi rank and a bus stop. And those are right next to the entrance to Vellore Fort. This is the fort's only entrance. And it leads to an area that is in the British records referred to as the Petta, the market, the Petta area of Vellore. And you can see the locations of, there's a covered market and there's a long bazaar street and there's a main bazaar street. So it was a very busy commercial area, obviously. It always has been a busy commercial area. Now, because of the Petta's proximity to the fort's entrance, this was the most desirable area for Vellore's exiled Mysorean community to live. All the most important people who had moved to Vellore, such as family members of influential courtiers, or people who are related to those living in the fort, they wanted to live as close as possible to the sons and women of the inner court. And in August 1806, a report about Vellore counted that there were 1,812 servants and adherents of Tipu Sultan who were living permanently inside the Petta area of Vellore. And of course, there were far more Mysoreans living in other parts of the city. More recent studies have estimated that there were, a conservative estimate would be 6,000 Mysoreans moved to Vellore in the early 19th century. And these exiled Mysoreans would have been nostalgic for their previous lives under Tipu Sultan's rule. They would have been a receptive audience to the performances of the first class unmarried Musarratis. The Musarratis were confined in Vellore Fort, but they continued inside of the fort their singing and dancing performances, which, as we talked about earlier, they wrote, and which most likely were commentaries about their topical new circumstances under East India Company custody. These performances would have been attended by the thousands of exiled Mysoreans who now lived at Vellore. So the East India Company had failed to understand that these women had an influential role within the exiled Mysorean community. We know that between February and June 1806, in the months immediately before the Vellore Mutiny, 4 of Tipu Sultan's daughters, all of whom lived in the Petta area next to the entrance to Vellore Fort, were married, and their wedding celebrations included performances inside Vellore Fort by the Musarratis. Each of these weddings would have featured several days worth of festivities inside the fort, where the Musarratis, who represented the mother's side of the family, performed their programs of music and dance. This slide, this is a company painting from Vellore, and it shows a night scene inside Vellore Fort, showing a Muslim wedding procession. And you can see there are fireworks going off, and there are these little torches that are being held up by these poles on either side of the procession. And I'm going to now show you a close-up of the middle of this picture. So you can see there are groups who are singing and dancing amidst the procession, and they are surrounded by people who are watching them. So I hope you can all follow what I'm now moving towards. To use a very modern analogy, if I may, the Musarratis were influencers within the exiled Mysorean community. The East India Company might have locked them up inside Vellore Fort, but by allowing them to give performances, they, pick up my phone here, they had let them keep their phones. They were the mouthpieces of resistance. And on the evening that the mutiny began, a notch was actually being held inside of the fort to celebrate the wedding of Tipu Sultan's daughter, Nur ul-Nisa Begum. In the court proceedings that describe the lead up to the mutiny, it is written that mere hours before the mutiny began, 40 dancers from the Tipu Mahal performed to the wedding guests inside the fort and remained there until after the mutiny. All 4 of the weddings that were held between February and July 1806 featured music and dance performances by the Musarratis. The storylines of these performances were written and narrated by women and were generally about women deceiving their superiors. So we don't know what the content of these performances was, but one does wonder if the Musarratis were casting the sepoys as characters in their tales of misbehavior. I'm now going to look at the Vellore Mutiny of 1806, just by quickly summarizing its military events. It began between 2 and 3 in the morning on the 10th of July, 1806, when the sepoys of the East India Company's Madras native infantry killed 14 officers and 115 men from the company's 69th Regiment. The rebels took control of the fort, and they raised the flag of the Mysore Sultanate. Then they declared one of Tipu Sultan's sons as their king. An officer escaped from Vellore and raised the alarm at another company garrison. A relief force commanded by Captain Robert Rollo Gillespie was raised, which arrived at Vellore later on that same day. Gillespie gave orders to kill any sepoys who stood in their way and executed those who sought refuge inside the palace buildings of Vellore Fort. In total, nearly 350 rebels were killed by the relief force that day, and then further executions followed. It was the largest sepoy uprising in the East India Company's history to precede the events of 1857. It was widely reported in both India and Britain, and investigations into its causes were inconclusive. Many historians, even today, claim that the Vellore Mutiny was prompted by dissatisfaction over the uniforms that the sepoy soldiers wore, particularly their hats. This is a picture I found online of an exhibition that was held in Vellore's Fort Museum. The exhibition was about the 1806 mutiny, and it included amongst its exhibits these mannequins dressed in sepoy uniforms. And if one looks through the court proceedings from Vellore before and after the mutiny, there are lots of mentions of the sepoys' uniforms, particularly their hats. So I'm going to start by looking at reports before the mutiny. So here's an account dated the 10th of May, 1806. So that's 2 months before the mutiny. And it says that two high-ranking sepoys, both of them were havildars, refused to wear the new turban-style hat because, and I quote, if they wore it, their caste would not supply them with water, neither would they marry their daughters. 9 days later, more complaints were lodged, this time by sepoys who claimed that, and I quote, their families would not live with them, nor would they prepare their rice for them should they wear the new turban. Then after the mutiny, there were further testimonies about the mutiny's causes. Here's one, I quote, the thousands of adherents of Tipu's house assembled and uncontrolled in the populous Petta at Vellore will ever furnish powers to disseminate the most destructive tales. One sepoy testified that, and I quote, Tipu's people and the village people would not continue them in their caste or give them rice or water or let them have their daughters in marriage. So you have here the same objections coming up amongst the sepoys, both before and after the mutiny. And the problem doesn't appear to just be the headgear. The problem was the threat of what would happen to them if they wore the headgear. These are all threats of domestic expulsion. Nobody is going to give you food and drink. Nobody will invite you to their house. No one will marry you. So how were these destructive tales circulated? When you put together all these pieces, one can assume that the Musarratis were using their platform as entertainers to actively spread information that led to the mutiny. They were never held accountable. The East India Company was never interested in their courtly roles, and their presence in the fort was never viewed as threatening. To the British, their imprisonment was an administrative task. They were insignificant people who had to be cared for and kept in their place. After the mutiny, in August of 1806, the sons of Tipu Sultan were exiled from Vellore to Kolkata, and by exiling them, the East India Company, possibly inadvertently, punished the women of Tipu's inner court by separating them from their sons and their grandchildren, the potential heirs to Tipu Sultan's throne. Any hope of fomenting another uprising against the British was put to rest. After the mutiny, the East India Company's reports on the women become increasingly bureaucratic. By 1821, when this report was compiled about the women, you have a table of their names that is titled a muster roll. That's a British military term. And then alongside their names, the table lists the size of their allowances, their ratibs. And it ranks them using the titles they held in the Tipu and Hyder Mahals in a payment system that resembles the pay bands of soldiers or civil servants. And you can see they've used the name Musarratis here to classify, well, you only see the first few names, but there are 52 women in this list who were categorized as Musarratis. So to the East India Company, this title, Musarrati, was now an administrative categorization. It no longer described their role within Tipu Sultan's court. As they grew older, the Musarrati women continued to occasionally assert their will over the East India Company. For example, on one occasion in the 1820s, they walked out of the fort and demanded that their allowances be increased. They remonstrated by invoking the names of Thomas Marriott and Arthur Wellesley, claiming that those men knew how to properly arrange their treatment, not these new people who were in charge of them. And one suspects there was a bit of insulting that was thrown into their remonstrations. In another instance, also in the 1820s, it was discovered that to stop their allowances from being cut every time one of them passed away, the women had hidden 25 bodies inside the mahals. Right, I'm going to wind things down here. This is a company painting from Vellore of a holy procession. And I'm just going to show you a detail from it now. You can draw your own conclusions from this. So the Musarrati women of Tipu Sultan's inner court played a part in the events of the 1806 Vellore Mutiny. They were the storytellers of Tipu's court, and they used the powers they held to improve their lives by trying to resurrect Tipu Sultan's dynasty. A key role of the women, of women in general in South Asian courts or in any court of that matter, has always been to uphold the family line and influence matters of succession. The most obvious way for a female courtier to raise her status was by having a son and situating him in a position of power. This seems to be what the Musarrati women were doing at Vellore in the lead up to the 1806 mutiny. Historians have overlooked documentation about the women of Tipu Sultan's court because it has been regarded as irrelevant. However, when the women's actions are contextualized alongside the historical events they lived through, one realizes that they were perfectly placed to spawn political discontent by scripting and disseminating narratives of their choosing. Today, we're aware of how biased and incomplete history can be, and this is certainly the case with colonial history. So when we find evidence of women's history, such as the accounts from colonial archives that I've talked about today, it's very important to explore them and ensure that they don't go forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is Fantastic, really. And, in continuation with what we saw the last time from what Priya Atwal spoke and what you're telling us today, I think you all are doing such a remarkable job in putting together the sort of unknown pieces of history from the women's perspective and making it so much more wholesome. So thank you so much for that. Really loved your session. A lot of compliments have been sent to me in private. I will, everyone's admired what you've said. There are a few questions, and I'd encourage anyone else who hasn't yet asked to place in their questions in the chat. Um, Let me ask, were these women literate? Is there any information of whether any of their communication survives?
Yes, well, none of their communication survives, but in Thomas Marryat's report of 1800, he does make a point that he discovers that a lot of the women of the Mahals are literate. And so he asks them to write down their wishes, how they expect to be treated on paper. And he says, I think he describes their responses as voluminous.
Wow. So that means that they were superbly, they were well read and they were articulate. That's amazing. And why were the British ruling them through young people? Was it effective for them? You started by telling us that a young 26-year-old person was in charge of.
Yes, well, it's sort of, it was the Orientalist way of doing things. By Orientalist, I mean people who believed that studying Indian languages was the way to control India. And so Thomas Marryat, he was, his father was friends with Warren Hastings. He came out of this Orientalist tradition of studying languages, and Thomas Marryat, he would have been a product of the English public school system. He would have studied Greek and Latin before he went to India. So then when he got out to India, he would have continued his language studies. And he was obviously good with languages. And that was why he was put in charge of these women, because they came from all different parts of India. They spoke different languages. There were Turkish speakers in the palace at Srirangapatnam. So it was assumed that the person they needed to do this job was someone who was multilingual.
As a key requirement. Okay. So Uday Kulkarni has a very interesting question. And I think a lot of us are thinking the same thing when you see how things are today. At that point in time, why did the British take any responsibility at all to look after these women after the fall of Srirangapatnam?
Yes, that's a good point, because if you look at what's happening in courts such as Lucknow, a few decades later, they're terrible to the women of the court there. They're pretty much just chucked out onto the street. It's absolutely appalling what happens to them. But I think, how should I put it? The Governor General at that time was Richard Wellesley. Richard Wellesley was the older brother of Arthur Wellesley, the guy who was put in charge of Srirangapatnam after the Fourth Mysore War. And Richard Wellesley, he really, he's pioneering this, he really believes in sort of researching different aspects of Indian culture and natural history. And and he's doing this for very ulterior motives, of course. He's looking for ways to make money. But it just feels like it is this moment in Britain's presence in India where it's taking Orientalist thinking and trying to use it to explore, come to terms with India and try to understand India. And I think it partially has to do with that, that I wouldn't say that they felt a responsibility towards these women, but they did think it was important to set up some kind of infrastructure for them. And of course, another thing is they put them in prison, I think, to prevent them from having more children. They're not able to remarry if they're locked up in Vellore Fort. And they're keeping them there until they're, past the point where they can bear children anymore.
They were never thrown out. I mean, they just died their natural death.
Yes, there are accounts here and there of women who are later allowed to leave, but this is only when they're quite elderly and because they have children who live outside of the fort who have said they'll take care of them.
There's a question from Ankur whether any of Tipu's descendants survive today.
Yes, they're in Calcutta. I mean, I don't know about Vellore. The thing is, I haven't actually been to India since I started researching this project. I'm desperate to get out to Vellore and see what I can find. But the exiled sons of Tipu Sultan in Calcutta, there are people there who claim to be their descendants. Google it. There's information about them.
So Adil is asking, when they were adjoining territories, which were British territories, why did they bring back the Wodeyar prince as the ruler instead of claiming it as their own after winning the battle with Tipu Sultan? Was he just a puppet prince and they could use the money?
Yes, yeah, he was a puppet. I mean, yeah, and actually that's a good point as well, that I think you find this in other kingdoms too, that the British would put in place as the successor to a throne, a child. I know that that's what happened in, there's a kingdom in southern Tamil Nadu, well, what is now southern Tamil Nadu, called Pudukkottai, where they put a child on the throne. And I think there are other places as well where that happened. And it was very much about controlling that kingdom. There, in Mysore, there was a resident who was the East India Company's representative in that kingdom. And then, and he lived pretty much side by side with the newly established court. So you had this little boy who was the king, and then you had courtiers who did the work, but until he came of age.
Yeah, Artika Bakshi mentions that it happened in Punjab as well.
Right. Yes.
Vinay Kashyap wanted to know if any of the women were repatriated to their original homes at all.
I haven't really found that much information about whether women were repatriated to their original homes. There is something in Thomas Marriott's 1800 report about how he thinks there will be very few women who will voluntarily leave the Mahals because they've left their families, and it's pretty much presumed that they are not going to go back. Yeah, he says there are going to be few takers. Yeah,
and they probably also had a good enough life, so to say, that they didn't need to escape or sort of go on to a better life.
Yeah, it was probably a more secure life than leaving the Mahals.
So you've shared a couple of paintings which were remarkable. One is the procession and the other is Holy, and I haven't seen these before at all. Would you share the painters' names with us and where we can see them? Yes,
well, so there are 3 different albums of company paintings from Vellore in London that I know of. The last picture I showed of the Holy Procession, that is from an album of company paintings from the late 1820s in the British Library. And then the painting of the Muslim wedding procession, that is in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I think that one's a little bit later. It might be sort of early 1830s, perhaps. And then there's a third album, which is in a private collection. And it has lots of the same pictures. They're sort of duplicated in these three different albums. Unfortunately, the album in the private collection, which I have seen, I have not been given permission to show pictures of it. But in that album, the artist is identified. And there's actually a portrait of the artist in the at the end of the book. I'm now racking my brains out trying to think what the name of the artist was. I might need to get back to you about that.
That'll be wonderful. Nazir has asked whether it's the only woman-dominant mutiny on record during, or women-supported mutiny on record during the British rule in India.
Well, there has been some really good research on causes of the 1857 rebellion and women who were taking part in that. I think that the one writer, I think her name is Angama De Jala, I think. But there have been papers written on women who fomented dissent during the 1857 rebellion.
Which I'm always corrected and told that it's now called the Indian First War of Independence. And of course, the
Yes.
Lakshmi Bai, as the Kulkarni points out, Rani Lakshmi Bai from Jhansi is of course leading the...
Yes. Yeah. I guess the curious thing about the women at Vellore is we know little about them as individuals. We know the names of some of the higher status women, mainly through descriptions of their sons. You have reports on the sons which mention the names of the mothers. But it is, I wouldn't say they were operating as a collective as such, but you do get a sense that when this whole thing starts, they're not as collectively organized, and then by say the 1820s, they definitely are collectively organized. There's been a lot of sort of smashing down of boundaries between them. They've been in this situation for a few decades, and they're doing their best to be heard, and not arguing amongst each other. They're arguing with the British instead.
I mean, if they could hide 25 deaths, clearly they were cohesive enough to...
Yes. They were in cahoots with each other, yes.
Great. So if there are going to be no more questions, then I would say a very big thank you to you. And I hope you will join us for the sessions that we have every Saturday, and a happy weekend to everyone here.
Great. Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Yeah. Bye-bye. Bye. Good night.
Bye.